but I go by Hilda. Secondly, you're all going, Chief Education Office, that means nothing. I will just tell you just a short transition to help you know where I come from and what I do. I was a classroom teacher. I taught in Florida. Anybody from Florida? Anyway, I taught there, and I did not make it into the high schools. I taught early childhood and then went, oh my God, no. Excuse me. Love them dearly, but it wasn't for me. And I taught middle school, and then I ran residential programs for high school students at a university. And it was designed to give high school kids an opportunity to experience some things that a university could offer them and get them excited. So there's a little bit of a connection there. I also served as a faculty member preparing teachers for many years at the University of South Florida, which is a very large Research One institution, prepared graduates about 45,000 students a year, just to give you a sense of personalization was not real big there. And when I knew I was going to move on to another deanship, I looked at several places, and one of them was in Monmouth, Oregon. And I understood it was right near Multnomah Falls, which really excited me because I thought that's going to be great hiking. And so I did come out and spent 10 years as Dean of Education at Western Oregon University, ironically. Did not know that I'd be looping back in some connections with this work with Western. So 10 years, loved it, really tried to make some differences in how we prepared teachers. Is it perfect? No, but I think it's a work in progress. And then I got a phone call. Actually, I wrote a letter. I got to tell you, I wrote a letter. You got to be careful who you write letters to. So I sent this letter whining. Complaint, no, I was observing phenomena. Like, we have silos and they're not connected, and how in the heck are we ever going to bring around change if you don't align change within K-12 with change in higher ed, with change in ed prep, with change in how we support families, etc. And I just let it go. You know, I sent it to the governor and to the, all the top people at that time. And then they called me and asked if I would come join or help start a very small agency. This is why you don't know about it. Very small. In fact, every day I look to see if the tarp has gotten smaller, because we don't fit the niche, just like you. We don't fit the niche, and so therefore we're not the Oregon Department of Education, we're not the Higher Ed Coordinating Commission, we're not Early Learning Division, we're not the Employment Division, or Youth Development. But our job is to connect all of those pieces, particularly in the world of policy, because if you allow everybody to do their own thing and you don't have some sense of a direction and a vision, then those kayaks are all going in separate directions. And so that's what brought me into my current job with the Chief Education Office. I work in policy, which could be really boring, but I'm going to try to make it very relevant for you in a couple of ways. On your tables is a 2-page synopsis that was developed and shared in July for the Higher Ed Coordinating Commission, and it was the result of about a year of convenings of a work group, because everything has to have a committee or a work group in our lives. And this group was exactly what you'd imagine if you bring people together who don't all agree. And it was a beautiful experience in a way, because I had the chance to sort of let time do its work. It's all about relationships and building relationships, as you well know, with your students. The same thing happens in the policy world. You can't just introduce a policy and expect everybody to go, oh, that's the best thing since whatever. They have to live with it, they have to feed into it, they have to give input, and that's where you're going to help me today. There are also index cards that I think have been shared. Because my own belief is that we do a wonderful job in each sector of education. We do a pretty mediocre job in every area of transition for students. And this goes all the way through higher ed too. I used to say to the faculty, nobody goes through our programs that we offer except our students. We never get to experience the program we have designed. And we don't have the same perceptions as somebody who is an actual student who went through whatever program it was. And so with this, I have come to a realization that particularly when we talk about students that have completed high school, I think our older metaphor was this. Graduation day, we shake hands, we wish them the very best. And for some of them, we're just excited that they're on the stage, right? There were a few we weren't sure were going to make it that day. And they did it, and they made it, and we're so excited for them. We wish them the best. And then there's those students that you've heard, yeah, they got a scholarship to this place, or they're going to some prestigious university and all of that. And so we cheer them on and we say, good for you, and go get them. And then it stops, right? And then hopefully in fall, right about a month from now in the public universities, they show up, right, at the universities. Well, some of them do. We already know some don't make it. There's a name for that. It's called summer melt. I'm sure you are familiar with that term. And we're working on that, by the way, because that's a real issue. But then what happens is they're into a whole new system. And that system doesn't know them like you have known them. You've already figured out their quirks, their needs, their specializations that they have to be successful. And a whole new set of people are having to learn that. Kind of like what happens sometimes between grade levels when we don't have good articulation and communication between teachers, and you don't have enough time to do that too. So what has happened with this work is that we have basically created an environment in the state that says it's time to do that work a little differently for a lot of reasons. I hear everybody talking about the amount of time and the amount of money that students save when they go on and take dual credit coursework or accelerated learning. And it is amazing. In fact, I wrote down those numbers. In fact, Dave, can I have a copy of all the numbers? Because I like to keep current and not give bad numbers out in Salem. That's a really bad thing to do. So with that, we have this opportunity that we created back in 2013 with the very first dedicated amount of money that was designed to invigorate innovation around this period of time in which kids are in high school and they can sort of move into more of that experience of being in college, whether it be community college or four-year institution. We didn't put limitations on that. So that was the first round of regional promises back in 2013. And it was built, in all honesty, got to give credit where credit is due, it was built on some design that had been done out in all places, Eastern Oregon. Because it's actually easier to do things in Eastern Oregon. You have one university, you have two community colleges, and you have, actually I think you have 3 ESDs that kind of serve that whole area out there. But it's easier, it's smaller, intact, they don't have as many options. And they had done some work in this area to really think about, well, what could you do to help a student actually transition smoother from that high school onto college level. And when I listened to Dave describe what you all are doing, I had to get out my Wikipedia, because the way I sort of describe the Willamette promise is that you're an example of a disruptive innovation. And I know you've heard that term. It's used a lot in the business world. Clayton Christensen coined it and then probably made tons of money going around talking about it. You could have done the same thing probably. But I just want to read you the definition. It says, in business, a disruptive innovation is an innovation that creates a new market and a value network, and eventually disrupts an existing market and a value network, displacing established firms, products, alliances, I would add practices, policies, etc. That's what you're doing. And I would say that you're doing it because you went further than the design of the innovation grant even anticipated, which is pretty cool. You went in an exploratory realm, and then but with the guidance of some incredible staff, you kept growing it and surfacing where the issues were, where the barriers are. And that's partly what's missing sometimes in policy work is we go, oh my God, this is a great idea. We're gonna put these things in a mason jar. It's gonna be fabulous. and we're gonna fund that, right? And then we'll get a report on the little sticks in the mason jar to see how well they liked it, right? And we'll go, wow, those are results, right? The kind of work you're doing requires an immense amount of data on lots of different levels. And we shouldn't say, let's wait 5 years to see the results. What we're looking at is an innovation cycle that constantly feeds back into the system to say, wow, we need to tweak this and change this because you all said it doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way in my community, it doesn't work that way in a real school, because you know, Salem people haven't been in, including me, have not been in a school for a long time. That's why your voice is important, okay? That's my intro. All right, questions? Okay, none. All right, good. One of the things we did this year, before I knew that I was going to, well, no, about the time I knew that we were going to form a work group that included all of these different parties that have something to say about accelerated learning policy in our state, I felt like I needed to go to students. Students that were in programs and students that were not in programs. And so I worked with a group called Oregon Student Voice. Has anybody heard of them? It's pretty cool. They actually train high school students to facilitate conversations amongst their peers on really important topics that impact their lives. I mean, only students go through our programs, right? So if we don't spend the time and listen to them and take them seriously, by the way, kids are practically always more serious than we give them credit for. You know, they'll get through their little, oh yeah, this is fun, but then they'll get down to hard tacks pretty quickly and give you some insights. So what I'm going to do today is to accompany the sheet that you have, I'm going to share with you some comments from the students. We surveyed over 600, and then we held focus groups with 2 different groups of students, and actually held those right here in this building. One of them was held right in this building. Beautiful facilities, by the way. Thank you for letting us do that. So when we asked them, you know, what's the value of accelerated learning credits? And I use this term because I have to. It's sort of in state law and policy. And accelerated learning is a big umbrella. It could actually handle more than just dual credit run through regional promise projects, okay? It also can include AP, it can include IB, what we used to always refer to as early college, middle college, a lot of different models. But what has been clear to me in the policy world is that the work you're doing around dual credit has the most potential, not just in Oregon, but nationally. And Dave, you probably are not aware of this, but within the last month, 2 more studies came out from the state of Texas, which they're so gargantuan in terms of their numbers that when they publish results, it's kind of interesting to read. And it mirrored exactly what the Hecht study found. In fact, Ben Cannon referenced it, which is really a good thing. So I digress. They give more students a greater chance of success. And the third comment on this one, I think that college level classes could be improved. It's nice when they kind of point out that you could improve. By making them better known to high school kids. I feel like a lot of kids are unaware of their opportunity to take them and the benefits that come with that. So out of the mouth of babes, those are pretty good straight on points that you'd have to say they've given some thought to this. So when we convened this group, we gave the group, it had a terrible name which I made up, called SASL, which stood for Sustainable Systems of Accelerated Learning. And the reason that I couldn't call it Accelerated Learning Work Group is that I'd already done that in 2014 with Senator Hass and convened that group, and that didn't get us anywhere. We had $15 million ask of the legislature, and then at the same time, Senator Hass had discovered Tennessee and the Tennessee Promise. And so you all are aware of Oregon Promise? Yes? Okay. Pretty good deal for kids that come through a community college for reducing their cost of tuition. And he got all excited and said, Hilda, I love your ideas, but this is where I'm going to put all of my energy and my votes. And so nothing happened from that first accelerated learning work group. The second accelerated learning work group reason why I didn't pick that name, was the group that actually established the standards by which you are all having to be approved. Not you, but the programs that you work in. How many of you are familiar with those standards? Okay? Wow, okay. There's something that you might want to look up later. So, we said, let's not just talk about accelerated learning, let's talk about sustaining this work. Because we cannot keep giving grants that are like magic addiction pills to say, here's some money, could you go do something really good with it in this area? And then,
you could keep doing the grants.
well, there's a reason that you can't. The budgets are a little bit too unpredictable from biennium to biennium. And what it means is that as soon as that funding goes away or gets reduced, what happens? The innovation stops, or it diminishes so dramatically you don't get the same results. And so that's what we were trying to avoid. Wait till you hear where I'm going and then come back at me with an index card, okay, if you think there's better ideas. So what we said to the group was that we want you to sustain Oregon's efforts to support cross-sector collaboration, because you cannot do this with just K-12. It cannot be done with just K-12. And to provide a sustained implementation and more equitable access for student participation in accelerated college credit programs and transitional support. So the very first thing we jumped on was funding. Because what we had learned, I had a Hatfield scholar work with me on this, and we tried to develop a cost model on every accelerated learning. I know this is boring. It's not your first day back kind of excitement and motivation, but I'll try to beef it up a little bit. So when we looked at a cost model and realized that there were costs that were covered by the charges for the credits, but there were also these lingering other costs that somehow weren't getting covered. Things like convening faculty and teachers together, paying for the research to actually continuously improve the model, developing the resources or access to the appropriate resources that you need. For example, here's a real quick wake you up. How many of you know at your high school that students have access to a research database that is beyond what is typically offered in K-12? That is really college level appropriate. Can you raise your hands nice and high? I'm not going to do anything to you. Okay. Well, that's better than I thought, actually. What we learned was that the state, in its budgetary wisdom, pays for a pretty low-level research database for the state, for K-12, and it's really not at quite the level that you might think colleges and universities want students to use. So that's one of those extra costs that we have to figure out how do we fund that. So on your paper, you should have some concepts here, starting with equitable access. And what we thought was important, as Dave mentioned earlier, serving the rural communities was really important. We knew that. We have people that try to look at the data for us across the entire state, and I keep asking them, tell me the pockets where we don't have the same level of access for students. Every time I drive through Glide, Oregon, you know, I go to Bend sometimes for meetings, and I always go through Glide, and I wonder, what is it like to be a high school kid in Glide? Does anybody know? I was gonna ask you to tell me later. But the idea here is that they need the same opportunities and supports as you might get right here in Salem-Keizer. And so how do we do that? So one of the things that we're suggesting as a policy going forward for the 2019 session, which by the way is going to start earlier this year, not that you're tracking that, but apparently politicians want to get back to their hometowns for the July 4th parades. I'll leave you to wonder why. And so they're going to start earlier at the end of January. So everything in my world is already beefed up towards the legislative session. We're already preparing budgets. The governor's budget will come out December 1st. You will see money in her budget for this. And one of the things that we said to the governor, by the way, the governor met with some of the students. She came out, talked to them. We had cute little cookies made, because it was like Oregon cookie, the year of the state. Great photo op for the kids and the governor. She loved it. That's the picture on the back. And we said, why don't we do something that, first of all, sets up an amount of funding that would be available for any area of the state that doesn't currently serve kids at a very high level in terms of access to accelerated learning. And we see that money is being brokered by both parties, both higher ed and K-12. It needs to fund things in both arenas. We'll let the partners decide who's going to actually get the transfer of funds and oversee the money, but it has to be split between the two groups. We put some other restrictions on that, particularly looking at rural areas, students that are traditionally underrepresented in college. And then we said, but that's not enough when we think about funding. Now we need to talk about how do you make the work sustainable, your point, rather than group dependence on competitive grants, which, by the way, we already know the story on that. It's an inequitable model to have competitive grants. How many of you know a school district that doesn't have a professional grant writer? Yeah. And that includes even some ESDs that don't have a professional grant writer. And I will tell you what, I've read the proposals for every single regional promise, including Willamette promise. I did say to somebody it was a really well-written grant. But that's hard to compete with. So already we've unleveled the table. Some communities in Oregon didn't have a fair shake. So what we're doing now is saying, this is a pretty radical big idea that I have to help COSA understand. Who knows what COSA is? Okay, those are your administrators that all get together and they kind of put their view on legislation quite well. And the new novel idea is that we should do a settle-up budget. And a settle-up budget says everybody gets your regular amounts, right? And you get some funding for accelerated learning, and so does higher ed. But what we want to do is incentivize your performance for the kids that you were able to help get through a system and earn credit. And so it would be a settle-up of your budget in the following year based on your real numbers. And we might do some weightings in there to look at particularly underrepresented students. That's who we're really trying to make sure has a fair shake. The governor often says that she wants every student to graduate from high school with a plan. We don't think just graduating from high school always comes with a plan automatically. And so this helps them leave with, oh, I did some coursework. I think I really want to go into an apprenticeship model, or I'm going to start at the community college because I've already earned 15 credits, or I found that Spanish really works well for me and that's valued and I could earn credits for that. So they all have different stories and plans, and they don't have to have the same story and plan. So the settle up would be a way of saying, looking at your region, how well did you serve students in that area, and then we fund that, okay? So that's, you can write down on your index cards at any time. Did you get one for the whole table? Oh, good. I was gonna say, that'd be hard. So you can write down ideas. That was the funding idea, okay? And by the way, students said this about funding. Give smaller schools more funding to allow a higher variety of college courses at those schools. Isn't that interesting that they pick up on inequities pretty quickly? Also, maybe offer more classes and a bigger variety of subjects. It seems like college classes in high school are mainly just science, math, and English. Okay, you probably have heard that from some of the students. So, moving to the next area of policy, and I'm watching my time, but I can't see it. Oh, there it is, good, all right. Credit transfer, whoa, my favorite topic. I think I added some more gray hairs in the last 2 years. Dave would attest to that. Got beaten up regularly and pretty much learned how to just keep standing and saying the same thing. You know when you're with kids and you realize that if you tell them something and then if they ignore it or say something back, and then you try to reword it and make it better, that doesn't work. So I'm learning, you just keep saying the very same thing over and over and over again. And that is that these credits should transfer. Now, the nuance is that in many places they do transfer beautifully, but in some places they do not. And having worked in higher ed for 30 years, I totally get the perspective of why some of the institutions say these courses can't automatically transfer. There's something called intellectual property rights, or intellectual freedom, academic freedom, that's what I'm thinking of. And this is the privy of the faculty. Now, I have an argument with that because when I had to prepare and assure that students completed a teacher prep program, which was a sequenced set of classes, right, to give you all the skills that you need to be licensed to teach, I could not, in good conscience, say, if you all are all the faculty teaching a certain course, that would be really large. We didn't have that many faculty. But you just go do your own thing, okay? Just do what you think is good. Here's the title of the course. By the way, there's some syllabi on the table. Just use those, you know, and I know it's gonna be great. And by the way, you guys are gonna get these students next. Good luck if they've got the outcomes that they need to be successful in a sequenced course, which many of these courses are sequenced. And so it is not really total picture of academic freedom to say, we're not gonna do the same thing across the state. And that's a really hard idea to sell. So we are doing what good political people do. We're riding on coattails. And that means that you find something that has potential that's being bought into by a number of people, and then you find the right way to ride on that. How many of you know about the credit transfer bill that was passed in 2017? One person, good. Would you like to explain it, please?
I asked about it.
You asked
I wanted
about
to
it.
know what was going on.
Yeah, I personally, you know, having had bills myself that I was working my way through the session, this was my favorite one. And I didn't do it, I had some testimony for it, but I thought this is the killer bill of the session because it opened the door about credit transfer between community college and university. So if you thought it was bad high school to college, imagine if you'd taken 2 years at a community college and then you go over to an institution and it doesn't count. I'd be pretty upset. That is when you really do start pulling out your checkbook and going, look at all the money that I spent and the time. And so what we're doing is riding on the coattails of House Bill 2998. I serve on a work group, of course, for that group. And it's a large work group. It's got subgroups. It's got way too many meetings. But what they finally determined was that they would develop what they call a foundational curricula of 30 credit hours. And those 30 credit hours were not necessarily linked to a college title per se, but they would be 30 credits that a student should be able to take, no matter where, at a public institution in Oregon, community college, and they should transfer to any public university in Oregon. This is huge. The state tried to do this several different ways in the past and couldn't do it because everybody has their own numbering system and their own titling system. So the notion was that we would ride on the coattails of that bill. It has also brought everybody who's involved in it to the realization the same thing should apply for your high school students. If they're taking a course that's been approved by a community college, then, and it fits under the foundational curricula, by golly, it should count. And they didn't stop there with that bill. They also called for, and by the way, they had to have that done by this fall. That's a really short turnaround for legislation to get enacted. So the legislators were very serious about this and not playing games. They'd heard enough from their constituents. They probably had a child that, you know, lost money somewhere when they transferred. And they said, but we're not gonna stop there. We're gonna ask you to develop what are called USTAs, Unified Statewide Transfer Agreements. And these, you need to develop 3 of these every single year. And they didn't even say when you can stop. And a Unified Statewide Transfer Agreement is basically saying, if it's an area of study, let's say biology, You need to sit down with faculty across community colleges and universities and determine the next 60 hours. You getting the picture now? That's 90 hours. I'm good with math. That's 90 hours where we're starting to get a roadmap that would enable students to actually transfer, at least from community college to four-year. So that's what we're writing on right now. They've picked 4 to start with. Biology is 1, English, oh my goodness, I went on vacation last week. Business might be 1, and there's a 4th one. It might be English, I can't remember. Like you, this is my first day back to work. It's like, whoa, email. All right, so that is credit transfer. If you have ideas on that, write them down, just say credit transfer. Let's talk about student supports. This one's pretty easy. We really feel as though the projects like Regional Promises and Willamette Promise in particularly figured out how to help students with the supports that they need. But not every place in the state has figured out that some kids are going to need a little more assistance to start taking college level coursework and being successful. They might need to revisit their writing skills. They might need a tutor. They might need some just-in-time accommodations. They might need better information, as the kids said, about what courses should I take and how do these work, and I heard something about financial aid, it impacts my financial aid, and that they just freak out when they hear that because they don't know enough to sort through it. And if they go and ask 3 people, oh, I didn't even say that, these folks said that, they might get 3 different answers. And so establishing some common information that is, quote, user-friendly. Students reminded us that those of us in Salem, and even sometimes at the district level, we write things that our attorneys love, but they're not understandable by families and students. And if your audience is a family who's trying to make the best decision for their kid, by golly, it's our moral right, our moral imperative rather, to write that in a way that's understandable, and that includes translating into Spanish, okay? So what we've also done on this is piggybacked on something. Did anybody here know we had a regional hire summit, a Reach Hire Summit? Nope, we did 2 of them. And it was designed to bring people like college access professionals that work in schools, maybe as volunteer mentors, Avid people, Aspire folks, Gear Up, all those kinds of folks, together with some folks from the colleges and universities that we call advisors, and then also counselors from the high schools. So we did that. We did the first one in 2016, and then we did another one in 2018. Had a total of almost 600 people attend these 2 meetings during the summertime. And so we knew we had something that was important and of value. And what they told us was that we want to get it straight too. We want the same information to be shared with families when they come to a university or to a community college, or for those volunteers to be able to access it. So we're piggybacking on something that you don't really have to pay too much attention to, but it's called C3. And it was a little collaborative that grew voluntarily out of a group of people who I used to bring together once a month. And they said, you know what? These are great little sharing meetings, but we really should form our own entity and start putting policy and practice forward. So C3 is one of the ways that we're going to piggyback on the student supports, because they are in the budget for the 2019 session to be able to provide those convenings that bring people together, to develop web pages that can cross over all the platforms, to translate information, to work with the existing project officials in each of the areas around the state, to be able to find out what a student still need to know and to get that information to them. And to also advocate for the services like data clearinghouses that are research compatible with college level coursework. What did the students say about, oh, did you want to hear what the students said about credit transfer? I had to edit it a little bit. Get rid of them or make college credit actually achievable. You gotta say that kid knows how to just put it to words. Make more of them and specify which classes give college level credit. give students more options of courses that they can take in high school that will transfer to college. I mean, they're definitely in agreement on that. When it came to student supports, oh, they said something interesting that I didn't know, and you can test this out in your high school to see if it's the case. When we ask them who influences your decision the most around taking accelerated credits, I'll do this teaching thing. Huddle and say at your table who you think it is. Huddle at your table and decide who do you think the student said they get the most information about accelerated learning credits and options.
I think it's oh, I took this class. I took it too. That's my yeah.
Brain is waking up. I would get back to talk to you all, but I've got me hemmed in up here, so I'm kind of like tied. They're getting all my attention. So anybody want to just pop out who do you think it might be? Back there, red shirt? Individual teachers. Let's hear another answer. Yes, ma'am, right here.
Other students.
Other students. Another option?
Counselors.
Counselors? They told us it was teachers. Now, interestingly, I think part of that is we have obsessed with testing for the past decade and used our counselor time for managing test schedules and all of those good things. And quite often, with the numerous types of challenges that kids bring to school right now, that's the other half of their job, is dealing with really serious emotional and mental and sometimes very life-threatening situations that kids are coming into school with. So it's no wonder that students are looking to teachers for that information. Well, as a person who prepared teachers, I can tell you there is no course in a secondary school preparation program curriculum that talks about this stuff, okay?
That's why we have Adam.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. However, one of the things that we think is that we could work on that. Every secondary level teacher should at least walk out knowing, these are some of the resources that I'm gonna be asked about by kids and families, and I better know what they are. If I don't know what Oregon Promise is, that means my kids are not perhaps accessing something that they could, or at least being aware of it as early as possible. So, one of the things that we're working to do is to develop a student portal, and this would allow institutions to actually also weigh in on what courses are transferring, so at least you have a clear picture, and it will highlight the inflexibility of some institutions. And that's a strategy on purpose, because let the numbers do the talking and let the data speak to the issue in the state. The last thing I'm going to close with is the fact that back in 2014, I tried to crack a big walnut. And I was unsuccessful. I went all the way to the top. I spoke with the president of the Northwest Regional Accreditation Commission. I think that's not the exact name, but it's the entity that accredits all of the colleges and universities in this region. California is so big it has its own, okay? So it's Washington, Alaska, Idaho, Oregon, all those things. And they, they send a team out, and it's a 7-year cycle. Every college and university knows all about accreditation. And this is not individual accreditation for programs, it's your general accreditation. And so I kept getting the wall when I would open up a conversation and say, why are we requiring teachers to have X number of graduate courses, credits, in a content that they're going to teach? What's the evidence that we have that that is what makes you the most effective teacher possible. Can I ask, just as a show of hands, how many of you have 20 credits graduate level in one content area? Okay? So once again, disruptive innovation, that's what Willamette Promise pushed, was a different way to think about that. And so you've been spared, in some words, a little bit of the agony that other areas of the state deal with when they say, we would like to get J.D. Hill qualified to teach a course at the community college. Now, the beauty of this is even nonsensical behavior should be compelling. Because what we know is that if, you don't mind if I use you, do you? Okay. If J.D. Hill applies to one community college, let's say you decide to do 3. Oh, maybe only 2, because it's a pain in the neck, right? 2. He could get rejected by one and accepted by the other. Same course, same credentials, but somebody looked at it and said, good to go, JD, and somebody else said, not meeting our standards. And again, faculty-driven decision. The presidents of the community colleges were given 2015 legislative session the ability to waive their requirements on a case-by-case basis, and they chose not to very much because they had to go up against faculty to do that. So it's kind of like you use your social capital very selectively, okay? So what we have found is that the accreditation standards specify that you must meet the same criteria as the faculty they are hiring. They don't tell you what the criteria has to be. They simply say, if you're going to offer college credits in a different environment, meaning a high school, you have to use the same kind of a selection process for the faculty. So you can't have 2 different sets of criteria. Now that just gave credence to a whole lot of institutions shutting down and saying things like, well, we're not going to approve JD. Okay, he doesn't meet our college qualifications. And yet, when I talked to various groups, including the unions, they said, oh, you know, there are a ton of adjunct professors who would love to teach these high school courses. We should be utilizing them. And I went, where are they when I tell you it's a block schedule and you're going to teach on Tuesdays at this time, and you're going to teach on, I don't know, maybe another day and another time. And by the way, it's a commute 32 miles each way. Suddenly, those adjuncts that were so interested in teaching these courses are not volunteering, okay? So what we've done, and this is a little bit radical, is we said, okay, got it, understand the standards that accreditation is going to throw at us. So we will go ahead as a state and fund institutions, this has to be universities to do this, to offer graduate coursework. And let's, by the way, be sensitive to the fact that you, if you took advantage of it, you don't have to, because you're in a different model. But if you were in another model that didn't use sponsored dual credit, you'd be worried about this. So why not make those credits at least available online, so you don't have to drive somewhere, predictable schedule, so if I have to get 20 credits in biology, I can plan when they're going to be offered online, have it across multiple institutions. We did this, by the way, in 2000 with Title I reading. And we had all the a bunch of universities cooperating together to offer coursework that teachers needed in order to meet Title I reading requirements. That happened like that. You had to get them, certified. So that's what we're doing, is that we're going to give some money to the universities to incentivize development of online courses for those teachers that need them. And then, Dave probably knows this, and your district people probably know this, there is a small fund that is operated by the Oregon Department of Ed and funded every 2 years by our legislature, and it's actually called the Accelerated Learning Fund. And the problem with it is such a small amount of money, and it has restrictions on it. It says to the school district, yeah, you can write and get some money to prepare teachers to teach an AP or dual credit, whatever. By the way, you cannot exceed a request for more than 1/3 of the cost of preparing a teacher. Well, what good is it? District said, we're not even bothering to ask for the money because it still means we'd have to come up with 2/3 of the cost to pay for the tuition or whatever training if you're going to AP or whatever. So where we are with that is actually raising the limit of that fund, taking the cap off, taking the restrictions off, and putting money in there. I think we asked for 1.2 or 1.1, somewhere in that, to be able to support that. Now, here's the challenge that I've put out to Dave. And that is, you guys are kind of in a special little group. Where's Gretchen? Oh, she's hiding back there, okay. So Gretchen, get your researchers together and start to find the comparable sample, because you guys are getting qualified to teach courses in one way, and the rest of the state is forcing us to make this process work under a different set of guidelines. And what we need is comparison data to show the impact of your teaching, and that your teaching has the same or better outcomes than somebody who managed to go back and pick up a bunch of graduate credits in a particular field. What I'm interested in is if any of you have had such powerful discussions in your professional learning communities with higher ed faculty where you thought they learned something from you. My assumption, my guess is, my hunch, is that they did learn some things from you. They may not easily admit it. And you probably learned some things from them too. Oh, that's what you think of as college level writing, right? Or you need them to have these experiences in lab sciences. But what I'm really interested in, if you have an index card, jot down any examples that you can think of where you saw a little light bulb go on in a higher ed faculty member's mind, where they went, oh, that's how you deal with kids. Because they don't take any courses in pedagogy. You knew that. Yeah. It's the problem with the doctoral degree. We prepare you to do research. We don't prepare you to teach. Even though 80% of their time at a non-Research 1 institution is teaching. Okay, leave it at that. So, as you can see, I'm probably way too analytical on the first day back from vacation. I managed to get through the handout, which was good. I've asked for your feedback on index cards. I tried to make my complex world of policy a little bit more accessible. And I also just want to say a tremendous thank you. Because what you are doing is actually giving students an equal, equitable chance. And so every time you go, oh my gosh, this is so much extra work, or I've got to deal with my time management to get all this done, and oh my goodness, if I teach writing, how many times do I have to read these papers? This is what the profession is about, is thinking about the students that you impact. And my guess is that you will have a thumbprint on the lives of so many students. And I have said that publicly about Sherry Clark. Is she left? If she's not here, we can talk about her. But her imprint on the career area is literally changing the lives of students. That's what you're doing as well. So from me and from the Chief Education Office that you've never heard of until this morning, I want to say a big thank you and an appreciation for what you do. As a fellow teacher who's not getting a chance to, oh my gosh, I'm getting an International Student Friday. So yeah, I'm gonna be like back into a 17-year-old in my house. So that part I'll have in common with you, but you have like 100 and, how many a day? A lot. So my hat is off to you. I honor what you do, and I thank you for your time today. I thank you for what you're doing, and I really will thank you if you give me index cards. Thank you.
Kate's up here. We're going to talk about FERPA. Is there anyone in here who does not know what FERPA stands for? You don't have to raise your hand. Oh, there's one.
I'll be late.
There. Okay. Thank you. I appreciate that. I'm often that lone person, and it's nice.
I wasn't alone, they just didn't raise their hand.
They just didn't raise their hand. It's the Family Education Records Protection Act. So it is the law that basically outlines what we do legally with all the data and the information that you have generated, collect, and use when it comes to dealing with students. Oh, there we go. So basically, this is a law that protects all of our student records and any personally identifiable information that is actually on that record. So it not only protects the actual record, and that is both, when we talk about a record can be both digital as well as the hard copy that we're standing here holding in our hand, okay? So just because something exists on your computer or in your grading webpage or your website or any of those types of things doesn't mean it's excluded from FERPA. It is still a covered record if it is something that relates to the student. The information that's on those records, because very often when you are disclosing information, it is not the record itself that you're disclosing. You know, I'm not taking this piece of paper that he has in his hand and giving it to somebody. What you're actually doing is taking information that is on that record and you're sharing it with somebody else, right? It could be information about grades. It could be information about attendance. It could be tardies. It could be any number of disciplinary records, right? Disciplinary information. But anything that's on those records is also personally identifiable information that relates to that kiddo. Is covered by FERPA. And so, there we go. What constitutes an educational record? Anything that directly relates to the student is maintained by the educational agency, which is your school district, the college, any of those particular groups, or is maintained by a person acting for the educational agency. Perfect example would be if you are working with a program through the ESD. In most cases, there's a contractual relationship between the ESD and the school district for the services that you're getting for that kiddo. And if we, as the ESD, are maintaining records, the information and that record would also be covered, and we would have an obligation to comply with FERPA as well, right? So it picks up not just the folks that are directly in your school district, but it picks up other people who actually are working with that kiddo as well. So, now there is some exclusions or exceptions, and actually the exceptions are pretty long, okay? There are some pretty easy ones, like subpoenas, right? FERPA is gonna tell you that even though a record may be personal, it may be identifiable, it may be related to a student, but if a judge signs a subpoena requiring you to turn over those records, that's something you comply with, right? Pretty easy. The other one that is the pretty standard one that we see is called directory information. Has anyone ever heard of directory information before? Okay, good. This is often when the kiddo comes back at the start of the school year, there is often a form that basically notifies the parent and the student what constitutes directory information. This is what I took off of the statute to start with. School districts can modify this slightly because they can have certain bits of this information that they just don't include, okay? Often, sometimes, like Western Oregon includes jobs that the student has held on campus, right? Not everybody does that, but they do, right? So when you look at directory information, don't make an assumption as to what is included in directory information. All of the agencies you work for are going to have a policy that's going to identify it. They're also going to have a notice that goes to the student and the parent telling them what it is. On that notice, it is going to give them the option to opt out of directory information, which means that if the parent checks that box to opt out, that while this information is directory information for every other student that you're working with, it is not the case for the student where the parent has opted out. and said, I don't want that information to be public, okay? But if you look at this, the agency that oversees FERPA has come to the conclusion that this is generally not very invasive to the student's privacy, right? And that's how they've defined directory information. Student's name, address, telephone number, email address, photographs, date and place of birth, field of study, grade level, enrollment status, dates of attendance, sports activities. In fact, directory information, a lot of this is what we use when we communicate when you go to the football game and it has all that information about the kid. That's where this comes from, right? The reason we're able to publish it is because it's all directory information. It includes their weight, their enrollment, their grade level. It can include degrees, honors, and awards, educational institutes that they've attended most recently. All of those are kind of perceived not to be very invasive of the student's privacy, which is why they allow it to be disclosed. A lot of people, we kind of forget about this, and we just kind of roll on assumption sometimes that some things just naturally make sense for us to disclose. So I guess I would always tell you that the first place when you're looking at a disclosure, especially about something that seems pretty basic, like an email address or a telephone number, right? Or even a grade level, that you need to probably check and make sure if you're going to be disclosing it to somebody, say outside the school, or someone who might not be in the direct kind of circle that we're going to talk about in a few minutes, to make sure that you in fact do have a directory information, that the parent has in fact not opted out, and that you can in fact still disclose this information. Okay, yeah?
Because we're high school teachers, you know, we're dealing with other people's children, and so their only option is, can they opt out of everything being done, or maybe they just don't want the telephone number and email address?
Yeah, so the question is, can a person selectively opt in and opt out? You know, I think a lot of people treat it as just an all or nothing, but as long as the parent has clearly communicated, and you can tell on the form, so like if the parent had signed the form and had crossed this out and say initialed it, right, so that it was a clear communication that it was intended to be, and then had still signed the form, then I probably would read that as that this was an excluded piece of information, and if someone was asking for it, I wouldn't provide it. Okay? But the key is obviously to look, right? And a lot of us, we just get busy, and we're obviously not sharing it with someone who we don't think is necessary to have it. Although we're going to talk a little bit about who fits into that circle. But so it's just common course that if someone in the building comes and asks us for a piece of information, we go to our little computer, we type it in, and we give it to them. And we don't necessarily stop and think, well, did I check the form and make sure that the kiddo and the parent have signed authorizing the release of that? And is it okay to disclose it? Any other questions about directory information? Okay. So, now what the purpose of FERPA is to basically control access to educational records, and it actually gives the parent rights and the student, you know, because you're maintaining them, right? And there used to be, way back in the day, people who would, the parent would come in, they'd want to see how Johnny's doing, and the teacher would say, yeah, no, I'm not going to tell you, right? And so a lot of these laws came about from people just kind of making what I consider to be stupid decisions, right? Because if Johnny's mom wants to know why Johnny's failing, why would we not want to communicate that to Johnny's mom? We want Johnny's mom to help us, right? But anyway, the law basically then came around and said parents do in fact have a right to access the educational records of their kid. And not only do they have a right to access them, if they think that you have inaccurately put those records together, they can request and amend those records, which this law specifically provides for, a process on how to do that. And it also controls the disclosure of who gets that information that's in that record. And this has become much more important as we get into technology these days, right? Because a lot of our online apps and tech programs actually do disclose personally identifiable information. And so we're happy to kind of make sure that we have good, clear releases and guidance and all those other kinds of things when we get to that. But that's where often the disclosure comes. Newspapers will often call you and want information about kids, right? There's a lot of different places, but this law basically is there to basically kind of control how that information is disclosed. So basically, the people who have control over these records is the parent, and that would include, by the way, folks, not just a custodial parent. A non-custodial parent has just as much rights as a custodial parent does, unless there is some specific court order to the contrary, right? In some cases, if there are situations where the child would be at risk, if the parent were allowed to have access, it's often in cases of either child abuse or domestic violence. The court may have issued an order that prevents you from disclosing information on that particular student, but absent seeing some sort of legal document signed by a judge, a parent has access, whether they are custodial or not. But the other person who has access is what we call an eligible student. And a lot of people forget about eligible students. And we forget about it in K-12 because we don't have a whole lot of them, right? Because you don't become an eligible student until you're 18, or, as I put up there, attending a post-secondary program, which is why I think it's important information for you in this day and age with what you guys are doing. Because it doesn't even matter if the kid is 16 or 17. If they are enrolled at Chemeketa, Western Oregon, or some other form of secondary program, they are now an eligible student, which gives them the right to access, amend, and all the other rights under FERPA, okay, to control over those records.
I have a
Yes?
question about that. So Willamette Promise being the way that it is, at what point do they become enrolled in one of these schools? Since it is unclear.
Why would it be unclear when they're enrolled?
Because they can opt in or out at any point up to the end of the school year, basically.
I would say as soon as they're registered for our program in one of your sections and exposed to that college credit, at that point, they're an eligible student. Because even though they
Makes
haven't
sense.
opted in for the grade or out, they're still working towards that college credit and earning that grade.
And I don't know that there's much risk of over-identifying as an eligible student. There's more risk at failing to identify as an eligible student and providing them the rights. Does that make sense? I mean, there's less risk of the self-identification as an eligible student and giving them the right to access records than there would be if you were to say no. Okay? All right. Yes?
Do they then have the ability to edit who can see records?
You know, that's, and the one that comes up, because there are, in our regular K-12 program, you will have 18-year-old students in your classes. Usually their senior year, and often the tail end of the senior year. So the question does come up in K-12, and it often comes up with the parent being, you know, the child saying, well, don't tell my parent, right? I am now 18, these are my records, and I'm the eligible student, I'm the one that controls the record. And the answer to that question is, well, not really, okay? Because as long as that child is still, as long as the parent is still claiming them as a deduction and they are a dependent, that parent has rights, okay? So while the child may be wanting to try and find a way to not have mom and dad monitoring their grades, that really doesn't work, right? Now, a lot of times what schools or institutions, Western Oregon has a standard form that they use that allows the child to self-identify whether the parent, whether they in fact are a dependent to their parent, and the school just keeps it on file. But you would basically just be able to ask the child, so, you're a dependent, you're living at home, mom and dad paying the bills, right? That would be enough to be able to make mom and dad still have access to the records. Yes?
That was gonna be my question, because I know for certain I have some students who, even before the age of 18, have a situation not a dependent on their parents anymore, so those students would have the right to say, no, my parents do not have access to my grades, I do not live with my parents, I live with somebody else, or I have another situation.
Yeah.
Whereas with other students, we would still keep their parents.
Right, the question speaks to, what about those kids once they reach 18 that actually aren't cohabitating with their parents? As long as their parents are not providing, because even though they're not cohabitating, if the parent is providing the financial support for that child, then I think they're probably still a dependent, right? So I think you have to kind of delve a little closer than just where they're currently living, but that is often a red flag for you to start engaging in a conversation. The part that gets real challenging for us is that the law doesn't treat really the student as an eligible student until they're 18. And so, you know, when you have 16 and 17-year-olds who are not living with parents, parents probably still technically have rights to those records.
Right. And
Right.
I would handle that with our counseling department.
Right.
But if I know for certain that I have a student that's 18,
Yep.
has a situation, is not living with a parent, has not been living with a parent, then they are not dependent financially on that parent.
Right.
Then they could be.
Right, because the law basically says as long as they are not a dependent, they are 18 years of age, they are now an eligible student and the rights transfer to them, and that parents no longer have the rights to those educational records. There are a couple exceptions for post-secondary that relate to drug and alcohol violations, but none of you should have to deal with that particular issue, right? Because it's usually housing type things that happen on weekends that you would not have to deal with. Right? But here, this kind of outlines for you guys, students over 18, parents can have access to the records and personal information as long as they are in fact providing for that child still. So 19, 20, 21, right, as long as they're in school. Under 18, parents are the ones with the rights. Students under 18 in dual credit classes, which is our program we're talking about here, those parents still have access to the records as long as the student is a dependent. Okay. Who else can we give access to? And this sometimes is where the rubber hits the road, right? Because we want to share with just anybody who we think it would be beneficial for. But the real key here is those that have determined to have a legitimate educational interest. Okay? So probably the person you're sharing the information with has to have some connection to that student and to their educational program. Not just someone you're standing in the hall doing hall duty with, right? And you decide to share that Johnny has been a challenging student because Johnny doesn't ever come to class on time, misses at least 10, classes a day or a month. That is personally identifiable information. You probably are sharing it with someone that you shouldn't be sharing it with. And that could be a FERPA violation. As simple as that. Even though you're teaching in the same school, you're all teachers, you all see Johnny walking up and down the hall, but if Johnny is not connected to that teacher in some academic or educational way, that is not information that you should be sharing. Right? And you have to think about, part of it is also thinking about, because sometimes you strip out the personally identifiable pieces of it to try and then share data, but always take a look at it in terms of how large or small is your sample size. Because even though you strip some of it away, are people still able to identify who we're talking about? For instance, if you have a math class and it is 10 male students and 2 female students, and you start talking about a female student, but you don't identify them by name, you probably have narrowed the field pretty dramatically for them to be able to figure it out. And it's obviously even worse if there's only one, right? Because then they know. But there might be enough information in what you've shared, even though you've tried to depersonalize it, that they can still figure out who you're talking about. And that's obviously I go home every night to share with my spouse all the trials and tribulations of my job. And trust me, there are plenty of them. Kids never leave me without something to do, neither do employees or administrators. But I can't share anything that could ever be identified to go back to a school district or a teacher or an administrator or anything like that, right? Whatever I share at home has to be so vanilla that nobody can figure out who I'm talking about. And that's the important thing to kind of remember as you have these conversations. Counselors can be good, but that counselor should be the counselor assigned to that student, and you should be talking to them for purposes of helping to guide them, right? Any questions? So the key is obviously the legitimate educational interest. Often that includes counselors, faculty, other high school staff. Just always be able to be sure you can make that connection. You know, even if it's 9 degrees of Kevin Bacon, right? Make sure that you can show that there's a legitimate educational purpose beyond what you're doing. All right, you have 5 minutes left to ask questions if you've got any. Wow. Also clear that you have no questions. All right.
I'll start. I'm a high school teacher, and I'm in one of those small schools. There's 4 full-time science faculty, so there's 2 of us teaching sophomores, 2 of us teaching freshmen. Beginning of the year, right now, we're getting those kids that they had as freshmen coming up as sophomores. I'm sitting down to do my seating charts. Is it okay to go to the freshman teachers and say, who do I not put next to each other? Who can I put next to each other? Getting that information from last year about these kiddos so that I set them up for success. I'm getting information about these kids from the teachers that had them.
Does anyone think there's a legitimate educational interest there? How many of you think there is? How many of you think there isn't? Okay, I think there is.
Okay.
Now, as long as you're talking to the teacher who had the kid,
Okay.
okay, so that they actually have some educational information to share with you that is not rumor or gossip, but actual fact. And you have that conversation solely with them about the kid that they had, and you're using it to make a decision related to the scheduling and the program for that particular student. I think that is a legitimate educational interest, and that can be shared. All the way at the back.
Some of the districts are moving to a Gmail as opposed to an in-network mail system. Google says they read or they scan Gmail for ads. Do we have to pay more attention to our Gmail accounts and what we write because of this, that some of our districts who are just jumping on board Gmail may not be aware of the legalities of this? Sorry.
Why did you just rain on my parade for today? They're actually reading your email. There's someone at Google that kind of goes through your emails that goes through the system? Or is it just a scan? And what are they scanning it for?
They're looking for your keywords.
For keywords.
It's not a person, it's an algorithm.
It's an algorithm. It's a computer. Well, I would always tell you anyway that you should be careful about email. Even if it's not going through Google and it's not being scanned, it is so easy to what would be the right word? Misaddress. I do it. I unfortunately, in this organization, there's at least 2 Lisas. Okay, so when I go into the system to send email, I can't send it by Lisa because otherwise the other Lisa gets it. I have to send it by my last name. And every once in a while, when I'm blind copying myself, I type in Lisa. And it goes to the other Lisa, which is not a good thing because all my communications, almost all my communications are confidential in some capacity. And I've tried really hard to be careful about that. But the funny thing is I just did it this morning, okay? So I guess I would tell you, it doesn't matter whether it's Google or if it's a district email system, I think you should be careful what you put in email to start with. You should not be using it to disclose a lot of student-related information, personally identifiable information, because I think that is inherently a dangerous task. Because even if you address it properly, any number of things could go wrong to misdirect that particular email and get to someplace. So that being said, I think go ahead, use the Gmail, but be cautious about how you do it and the information that you put in there. I saw another hand here, and then we'll come up here. to the
Mine's
front.
in answer to that question. Our district has a policy where if you want to use a student's name, we have to do a Word document that we attach to the email. So
Okay.
you're not allowed to use student, and we use Gmail, so maybe that's.
So you can't actually use the student's name in the email. It has to be attached as a document, and then the document outlines what you want to share.
Literally, the document just says the student's name,
Oh.
and then in the email, we talk about whatever, we just don't ever
Got it.
use their name.
Yeah.
So what about a parent
Okay, so the question is, what about if a parent emails you and they want specific information? Nothing prevents you from responding to the parent with that specific information. I would, like I said, sometimes I would think through, is this better with a phone call? Is it better with an email, right? And that's gonna depend on the issue, the information, all those other components. Do your best to maintain the confidentiality of those. I always mark my documents when they're confidential. Like you could tag it confidential, student information for the parent, so that it's very clear. I have some of the same disclosures you have, that if somebody gets it accidentally, they're supposed to immediately delete. All those kinds of things can help you. Mistakes happen. The issue is whether or not we're taking all the necessary steps to try and prevent information being provided to the wrong person, right? All right, I'm getting the hook here. Thank you very much, and good luck with the start of the school year.
Thank you.